Ever wonder how some photos have this beautiful blurry background and the subject just pops out of the photo? In today's video, we're going to be covering aperture and this guy, the exposure triangle, and how these things work together to hopefully get you a manual mode and start getting you to add style to your photos with manual mode. Now, before we get too much into this, we're going to go over aperture and what aperture does to a photo, how it affects the background or the foreground, and how you can use it to your advantage versus wondering why your photos are a certain way when you don't want them to be that way. Now, what aperture actually is the size of the opening inside the lens that lets the light through. A smaller aperture is going to be a bigger opening. A bigger aperture, and when I say bigger, I mean a higher number. A higher number aperture is going to be a smaller opening in the lens. So that's where you have to get into how ISO and shutter speed work with aperture. This would be an example of a higher aperture. As you can see, the hole is very small. As you decrease aperture number and f-stop, the hole gets bigger, allowing more light. The most important thing for the exposure triangle and manual mode is figuring out what's most important to you. If you're shooting wildlife that's moving or sports, then shutter speed is going to be the priority over aperture and ISO. In that case, you would want to set the shutter speed and then adjust the other two settings to accommodate it. In this situation, we are taking portraits and we want to have a nice soft background. We want the model's face to be perfectly clear, but everything else be blurry. So in this case, we want to use a lower aperture number. This will allow us to use a higher shutter speed and a lower ISO and still give us a nice sharp photo. We're going to go over how these things work together a little bit more in depth with my whiteboard, but I just wanted to give you an idea up front. ISO is always the last thing you adjust. It is basically adding light to the photo via the image sensor in the camera. So you always want to do that last. It's either going to be shutter speed or aperture that takes priority. Like I said, if your goal is to get a certain look to the photo with aperture, like if you're doing landscape and you want everything in focus, everything nice and clear, you have to use a higher aperture number. So in that situation, you would set the aperture at like f11 or f14, and then you would adjust the shutter speed and the ISO to accommodate for that aperture, because that's what is important. Here I have an example of a low aperture number with these two objects. As you can see, the object in the front is in focus, the object in the back is out of focus or blurry. This is what aperture does to your photo, and that's because of the depth of field that you get associated with aperture and the aperture number. The lower the aperture number, the shallower the depth of field is, and that's the depth that's in focus. So if you're trying to achieve a shallow depth of field, you use a lower aperture number. If you're doing landscape photos and you want the whole photo to be clear, like this example here, you can see that both subjects are now in focus with a higher aperture number. This gives us a larger depth of field. Now, what do you need to understand about this? If aperture is your priority, then as this goes up in number, you get a larger depth of field, but this must go down. The shutter speed must go down in order to accommodate for the light, or the ISO must go up. One of the two. Either this goes down or this goes up. In the case that you're doing portraits, you have two subjects, you want both of them in focus. You want to go up with this, you want to keep this the same, and you want to increase the ISO to accommodate for the higher aperture number. This will give you a little bit grainier of a photo, but it'll give you two subjects that are in focus and a photo that you can work with versus one subject that's in focus and one subject that's out of focus, because you can't fix that. If you're shooting wildlife and it's just one subject and it doesn't matter, it's fast moving animal, this goes down, which allows this to go up, which gives you a higher shutter speed to freeze the moment without having to do anything with ISO. The only time you would have to adjust ISO if you're in this situation is if the light is low and you need additional light to expose the photo properly. In the case where you're doing landscape photos, you want everything in focus. This goes up to a higher aperture number Because of that, you're letting less light in, so the shutter speed must go down. If you're handheld shooting, it can only go down so far because you have to account for the camera shake. We will go over that in the video about shutter speed. But in that case, this goes down as low as it can go. If the photo is still not exposed properly, then ISO goes up. That's why I said ISO is always the last thing that you adjust to accommodate for the photo. In the situation where you're doing, let's say a portrait photo shoot, and the model's face is the most important thing, you're doing close-ups on the face, so you want a low aperture number because you want to let as much light in, you want to be able to get a nice blurry background. But let's say the model lays down and now her feet are closer to you than her face. In order to get her feet and her face in focus, this must go up. If that goes up, this must go down, or this must go up. One of the two. See how they work together? On the flip side of that, you can also, depending on what your style is, you can have blurry feet and a clear face, and it's still okay. But I just want to help you understand what aperture does so that you know how to use it. In most situations, I have found a lower aperture is more useful than a higher aperture, except for landscape photography. Landscape photography, you typically want a higher aperture, but most of the time, if you're shooting portraits or wildlife, you're going to be somewhere on the lower end of the aperture field because you need the shutter speed. Here's an example where I could have used a higher aperture. As you can see, the two ducks are, the duck in the front is in focus, the duck in the back is out of focus. Had I used a higher aperture number, I could have gotten both of them in focus, and I feel like the photo would have been better. Just remember, if aperture goes up, shutter speed goes down, or ISO goes up. One of these two things must happen if the aperture goes up. Same thing happens when aperture goes down, shutter speed goes up, or ISO goes down. One of these two things must happen to expose the photo properly. And that's how these things work together. If you're not comfortable with manual mode at this point, one thing you could try doing is shooting in the AV, which is aperture priority on Canon. I'm not really sure what it is on other camera models, but you can look it up. What aperture priority does is allows you to set the aperture what you want, and the camera will adjust the ISO and the shutter speed to expose the photo properly. This is not necessarily the best way to get the look that you want, but it is a great way to learn what the three things do together, because the camera is going to change the ISO and the shutter speed to expose the photo properly. You can take the photos, you can go back and look at the settings, see how the photos came out, see why they came out the way they came out based off of what the camera did to adjust for your aperture. And it's a great way to get an idea what you should be doing in manual mode. When I first started shooting, I always shot in shutter priority or aperture priority, but then once I really learned what the exposure triangle does, I got away from that completely and I just use manual mode now. It's really helping me out. That's why I want to try to pass this information along to you guys. I hope that you learned something from this video about aperture. If you did or didn't, leave me a comment. I'd like the feedback so I can fine-tune my videos in the future. The next video in the 3-part series is going to be shutter speed. In order to really understand the exposure triangle, you need to watch all 3 videos. So I'll put a link right here, and I'll see you over there at part number 2.